Hi, I'm Monique DeLuca. I'm the current Performing Arts Fellow, Physical Therapy Fellow at Johns Hopkins Medicine. And today I'm going to discuss with you important considerations for returning to dance during COVID-19 pandemic. My goal is to provide you with some kind of fitness recommendations to help transition back to full dance. So some key concepts. Number one, when returning to dance, it's important to remember that you cannot start where you left off. It's going to take time back to normal, take time to get back to normal. So over this time, we've been quarantined, we haven't been in the studio, we haven't been dancing. So after about 4 weeks, the effects of deconditioning have set in. So even if you continue training at home, you're training in different ways, you're training in different spaces, you're likely not moving the same way. And so as you return to the studio or return to more normal dance, it's important to think about sequencing, moving from more easier skills to more advanced skills, thinking about, things like jumps, things like that you may not have done, thinking about, working in small spaces or likely only have been moving in smaller ranges. So things like Grand Allegro are going to take a little bit longer to get back to. Number two, not everyone will be at the same level or starting point. So even dancers that may be in the same class, their circumstances at home over this time may have been different, and therefore it's not realistic to expect every single person to be at the same place. Number three, you want to focus on the whole dancer. This includes physically, mentally, emotionally, and psychologically. This model here to the right is from the Harkness Center of Dance, and it's the biopsychosocial model. I like this model because it kind of shows how all the different realms of the overall wellness are connected. So from a biological standpoint, has there been a previous injury? Are they having pain? Have they been ill? What's their nutrition been like? What's their sleep been like? All of those things are going to factor how they are as a whole. And then from the same thing from the psychological realm, you can see, are they stressed? During this time has been a time of uncertainty. So stress has been high, fear, worry, anxiety, all those things may be heightened. Personality type, certain people may cope with this differently. And then from a social cultural perspective, their relationships, their culture, their customs, within a dance company, how that dynamics is different within the company. Are they required to travel? So right now, especially in the arts world, the jobs have been affected. So their social and cultural realm is going to be affected as well. So the purpose of this actual presentation is going to focus more on the physical side of things, but it's important to note that each of these components are involved and shouldn't really be overlooked in terms of talking about overall wellness and the whole dancer. As a side note, if the psychological realm or mentally emotional things are heightened at this time and that's something that you're seeking further information for, I would encourage you to watch the IADMS, the International Association of Dance Medicine, has put together a good series of webinars about dancers helping themselves and specifically dealing with mental health. So number four, this is a great time to incorporate fitness training. I think generally this is an area that dancers tend to shy away from. I think the mentality of, oh, I dance, that's my fitness. But in reality, other fitness training in addition to dance training is going to improve overall dance abilities and help reduce injury. So to do this, it's important to progressively load the system by changing volume, range, and intensity of movements, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Just as a side note, one thing in regards to fitness training to think about, I went to a previous conference and the keynote speaker was MJ Lederbach from the Harkness Center of Dance. And one quote that she said was something along the lines of, you cannot do your sport to train, but you train to do your sport. So I think that's kind of a key thing to think about in terms of fitness training and how we need to use that in order to improve our dancing. And then finally, the last key concept is to communicate and collaborate. So right now, being that there's so much going on, there's so much uncertainty, there's so many areas and realms and factors and things that need to be addressed. Now is the time to collaborate with other professionals, whether that be medical professionals, other dance teachers, other professional dancers, things that to see areas that they can help on to get the best in each area. It's also important to communicate. Right now, we've been separated through quarantine, and so our communication is going to be limited. Thankfully, we have things such as technology and have been able to continue somewhat of that training, but it's going to be really important for teachers to check in with their students, students to check in with their teachers, let them know where they're at, because maybe you're doing classes via Zoom or online. That kind of feedback that you're getting is going to be much harder to do virtually than in person. So I think making sure you're keeping that open line of communication is really important. It's also important for other teachers to communicate with teachers, professionals, things of that nature, to make sure we're all on the same page and working with the focus of the dancer's health in mind. All right. So in terms of injury prevention, it's important to know that injury is due to both intrinsic and extrinsic factors. So for intrinsic factors listed in this chart here, your sex, your weight, your flexibility, your strength, your sleep. Usually intrinsic factors are more some of the things that the dancer themselves can control. So the dancer has some control over developing their flexibility, developing their strength, making sure they're practicing good sleep habits. Extrinsic factors usually has more, the dance teacher usually is going to have more control of this. So the environment, the room temperature, the floor conditions, the music tempo. So those are things that the teacher may adjust to help reduce injury. So, poor floors for jumping may lead to injury. A cold room where the muscles aren't able to warm up, that could lead to injury. Faster music, you're going to be moving at a faster pace. It requires more coordination and things of that nature, so that can cause injury. A big thing to think about is that fatigue leads to injury, especially while we have not been dancing and been deconditioning. We're going to probably fatigue at a much quicker level. So that's important to consider when returning to dance, making sure that we're not overexerting ourselves to the point of fatigue, which can lead to injury. So the second note here says it's important to have periods of rest. And it's also important to note that your body gets stronger on recovery and rest days, not on training days. So if you're just trying to go hard, hard, hard every day, never giving a break, you're not letting your body adapt and you're not letting your body truly get stronger. We'll kind of touch more on this when we get into periodization, which is kind of a systematic way in terms of training that's incorporating both rest and training. Okay. Next. So right here, next are a bunch of fitness recommendations from the American College of Sports Medicine. So these are the areas that the dancer kind of can work on during this time, especially when our dancing and our performances are still limited at this time. This may give us more time to focus on these areas that are often overlooked. So the general 3 main areas of fitness include our cardiorespiratory or aerobic endurance, our muscular fitness. This includes muscular endurance, strength, and power, and then our musculoskeletal flexibility. And this is usually accomplished through both static and dynamic stretching. So listed here, I've kind of showed you how the training would be different to achieve each of these areas of fitness. So for cardiorespiratory fitness, usually you want to do this about 3 to 5 days a week, and the intensity should be from moderate to vigorous for about 40 minutes. So there's different ways to grade intensity. Most people are probably aware of your heart rate in terms of developing or testing your heart rate max, and then taking your heart rate, seeing where it is, trying to be at 60 to 80% of that. Sometimes that can be a little bit more complicated. So another option would be using the talk test. So the talk test is basically while you're working out, trying to say a few words or sentences. If you're able to speak if you're able to speak short sentences, that would be considered moderate intensity, versus only being able to speak a few words is a vigorous intensity. So if heart rate and wearing your Fitbit or whatever isn't working, the talk test can be a good option. Moving on to muscular fitness, this is something they recommend doing about 2 days a week, and the amount of repetition and load is going to be different depending on which area you're trying to focus on. So for muscular endurance, you usually want to have less weight, it'll be light to moderate loads, 2 to 4 sets at 10 to 25 reps with 30 to 60 seconds of rest in between. So depending on the area that you're trying to improve, whether it's upper body, lower body, core, you would want to do those repetitions and that volume and sets of exercise. For strength, you're going to have a little bit more weight than muscular endurance, so you're going to be more moderate to heavy. The sets then are less. Instead of 2 to 4, you're only going to do 1 to 3 sets, and the repetitions are also less. So instead of 10 to 25, like you would do endurance, it would be more 8 to 12. And then with that, you're also going to take longer periods of rest. So the more weight you're using, you're doing less reps, less sets, and a little bit longer rest in between. And then finally, power, that's going to be even heavier loads at 1 to 3 sets, 1 to 5 reps, and 2 to 5 minutes of rest. So even less reps and even more rest because that load is so much heavier. And then in the last category, musculoskeletal flexibility. So static and dynamic stretching. With stretching in general, it's important to know when to do which kind of stretching. So static stretching is something that you want to save more for after activity, after your muscles are already warm. You don't want to go right into a static stretch when you're cold because that can also lead to injury. So recommendations for static stretching would be about 5 days a week, 30 to 40% of intensity, really making sure you're not pushing into that painful point. We're trying to stretch the muscles, but we're not actually trying to overstretch our joint capsules and cause, hypermobility or instability in the joints. You want to hold those stretches for about 30 to 60 seconds and doing those about 2 to 3 sets. And they recommend doing at least 5 minutes per week per muscle. For dynamic stretching, this is going to be more of a slow, controlled, but it's more of an active stretch. So this is something that you could do before or during activity to help kind of warm up those tissues. It's something that would be good to do prior to dance or prior to exercise. So this is just a table here from this article in the International Journal of Sports and Physical Therapy. I like this just because it kind of categorizes each area that we just had talked about and just giving you kind of a guideline of, how much should you do and how long you should rest for. So you can see power, like I said, how you're using that higher load, you're doing less reps, lower volume, longer rest period. And then that increases as you go through here. So the other thing to note is that within this physical fitness realm, there are specific skill-related components, and they're all listed right here from the American College of Sports Medicine. So starting off with agility. So agility is the ability to change the position of the body in space with speed and accuracy. You might think of agility training like in sports, kind of running down the field or going through cones and things like that. Coordination, the ability to use your senses, such as sight and hearing, together with body parts and performing tasks smoothly and accurately. So obviously when we're dancing, things are very coordinated to do things such as pirouettes or turns or even jumping. Balance, the maintenance of equilibrium while stationary or moving. Balance, as we know, is a huge component of dance, and in being able to stay in releve or standing on one leg in a passe. So making sure our balance is up to par is important. Power, the ability or rate at which one can perform work. So this is what we're using when we're doing our jumps or petit allegro. You really need that power through your body to rise off the floor. Reaction time, the time elapsed between stimulation and the beginning of reaction to it. You want to have fast reaction as we're adjusting and changing our body in space. So in a choreographed dance, there's quick adjustments of weight shifts of body going from one way to the other, and your reaction with time within your body needs to be quick in order to make those positional changes. And then speed, the ability to perform movement within a short period of time. So going across the floor, we know there's our adagio or more allegro. There's going to be more our allegro type activities. It's important to note that with all of these components, they're all interrelated. So each of these skills require a mind-body connection. And so you need to be able to efficiently send signals from your brain to your muscles. And in order to achieve one, you need the other. So for example, in order to maintain balance or stability, you're going to be able to need to make quick changes in position or agility. And you also need that quick reaction time in order to be fast and agile. So the speed is also interconnected. All of these processes, because they are skills, you're going to need to go through a process of motor learning, which we'll talk about in a second. And it's also as you're deconditioning, these skills are going to be detraining. So your reaction time is going to your reaction time is going to slow as your nervous system deconditions, which is going to result in increased errors, falls, and injuries. So it's important to you, when I talked about sequencing, making sure that we're starting with things that are at an easier level. We're going to go kind of through that motor learning process again to make sure we're back up to that higher level where we're reducing injury. Other things in terms of specific to quarantine and the COVID-19 pandemic, when we're dancing at home, we likely don't have mirrors. So things like balance, especially in our younger dancers, may be impaired at home. They're not getting that kind of feedback at home from the mirror, and therefore even their coordination balance may all be affected. So that's just something to think about in terms of what we're doing at home and what we're kind of our expectations are for each dancer. Also on that same line, power. At home, we're likely not have been doing a lot of jumps or larger movements, and our power has likely deconditioned. So as we start building back into that, it's important not to do too much too quickly, because as our muscles have gotten weaker, we're going to rely more on our smaller endurance muscles. And those muscles aren't meant for that heavy loads needed for power. And that's when things like injury, strain, overuse syndromes, tendinopathies may occur if we're loading too quickly and those smaller muscles are trying to pick up the slack for the larger muscles that may have gotten weaker over time. So this just goes over the 3 stages of motor learning. Like I said, for all of those skills, we have to go through this process of motor learning. So they kind of go in these 3 stages. We start in the cognitive learning stage. During this time, there's going to be more errors. Things aren't going to be as efficient, inconsistent, movements are slow, and it takes a lot of mind control, large parts of consciously aware. You're really thinking about what you're doing. So during this kind of process of learning, I was saying things like the mirror are going to be really important to help with that processing. From there, we move into associative learning. So movements start becoming more fluid, a little more reliable and efficient, and some parts are starting to be a little more automatic and not having to think about them as much. And then finally, the last stage of motor learning is the autonomous learning. Movements are accurate, consistent, and efficient, and movements are largely automatic. So through here, you don't have to think about it as much. You know, you're kind of ingrained in your system a little bit more. So something simple as like riding a bike. When you're first learning how to ride a bike, you know, you're not sure how to do it. You might be falling off a lot. You're going slow. And then there comes a time where you don't really think about it. You just get on and ride the bike. That's going to happen with dance movements as well. So our goal is to kind of get to this autonomous learning, but we have to make sure that we're really staging through ways to kind of progress as you are getting better and progressing through is to increase the variability. So whether that be timing, whether that be, you know, no mirror, whether that be kind of anything that will make it more variable. Versus when it's earlier, they're going to require a lot more feedback. So if they're still learning and haven't really mastered it, that's when, as a teacher, as a healthcare practitioner, that's when you're really wanting to give more feedback to make sure they're doing those movements properly. So this is from a panel discussion given by IADMS during this COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things I liked is they kind of talked about the time frame to detrain for each area that we had previously talked about. So it's just something to keep in mind of what kind of has happened while we haven't been dancing at the same level. So speed, for example, it takes 5 plus or minus 3 days to decondition. So speed is going to be something that we need for, that could be measured potentially by our 1 jump for max height. That might have slowly deconditioned. Actually not too slowly, 5 plus or minus 3 days. Our strength and endurance takes a little bit longer, 15 plus or minus 5 days. So strength and endurance is something that we need for, in dance, for example, like fouettes, you're using that strength and endurance to continue doing those fouette turns. Anaerobic endurance, so this is endurance without using the extra oxygen. So for example, that would be like a solo dance that's less than 1.5 minutes. This takes about 18 plus or minus 4 days to lose. So over this time, it's been at least this time months now, all of these areas kind of have been deconditioned. And then finally, aerobic endurance or maximum strength takes about 30 days plus or minus 5. And so aerobic endurance would be, dancing a solo for more than a minute and a half, or maximum strength would be a 1 max lift. So like I said, again, all of these areas have likely been detrained. So some recommendations from Dance USA, oh, that's a typo, sorry about that, Dance USA, is that you want to maintain a baseline conditioning at home. Dancers, they recommend, should continue modified classes 3 to 5 times a week and complete some form of cross-conditioning at least 3 days a week. So that cross-conditioning is that fitness training that we were talking about earlier. And they say it's optimal during the off time that a dancer maintains approximately 2 to 3 hours a day of movement. I know right now when we're home or quarantined, we may have been sitting a lot more, not walking as much, not moving as much. So they're recommending to continue that movement. And then as you return to work, they have some other guidelines. So they recommend that a professional dancer who is accustomed to dancing or rehearsing 6 to 8 hours a day complete 2 to 3 hours of movement daily, 5 to 6 days a week. That's similar to what they just said before. And this can be divided into traditional dance styles and cross conditioning. Once they've received a return to work date, then they should plan to gradually ramp up their training. So they say they should plan for a 2 to 3 week ramp up period that brings their total amount of time working up to 4 to 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. So previously it was 2 to 3, now you're bumping it up to 4 to 6. And then once they're cleared to return to the studios, they want to take another 2 to 3 weeks to build up to that 6 to 8 hour workload at full capacity. They do note that after 8 weeks of detraining, research has shown that elite athletes require 12 weeks of retraining to return to baseline level of fitness. So this is kind of what I was talking about before. Taking note, think about all the detraining that has happened over this time. And now to build back up to there, it's going to take a good 12 weeks, and that's in elite athletes. So, it may take even longer for our younger dancers. Time periods involved in gradually turning back to dance training varies depending on the dancer's ability to have maintained dance-specific training, physical fitness, and strength. So like I said, it's not realistic to expect the same thing from every person. We're going to be all at different levels, and it's going to take time to get back to it. So being aware of those differences is important. And then finally into periodization. So this is what I was saying we would talk about a little bit more in terms of mapping out our exercise to help reduce injury. So periodization, the definition is the planned manipulation of training variables. This includes load, sets, and repetitions in order to maximize training adaptations and to prevent the onset of overtraining syndrome. So basically, this is a balancing act between fitness and fatigue. So periodization is broken up into various components. So there's 3 cycles as listed here. There's a microcycle, which is about 1 week, a mesocycle, which is equal or greater than 1 month, and a macrocycle, which can be 1 to 4 years. And then there's 3 phases. Generally, you're transitioning from through these phases. You start with your hypertrophy or local muscle endurance stage, progressing to basic strength, and then to strength and power. At the same time, there's these 4 periods that are happening, again, kind of following that same transition. So you're starting your preparatory stage into the transition period, competition period, and then finally there's a secondary transition or active rest period. So the benefits of periodization include reducing the risk of overtraining, preventing plateau in progress, and promotes peak performance. This slide shows a nice graph kind of what periodization kind of is going to look like. So as I talked about, so you start with your preparatory period. So this is going to be, when we first return to dance, and then down the road, the competition period would be more of when you have your performance. In dance, this is a harder thing to incorporate because generally there really is no off season. We're generally dancing all year round with multiple performances. So this is going to be a little trickier to incorporate. However, I think right now, especially with quarantine and not really having set performance dates right now because of the pandemic, we have a little bit more time to kind of ramp up and build up to that performance competition level. And so I think this would be a great time to utilize this model. So this kind of shows in the preparatory phase, this is returning, you want to have low intensity and high volume. So it's more of your basic strength, basic exercises, just to kind of get the body a little bit more conditioned. During this time, you'll also note that you're going from more of a general fitness starting here towards the end is more sport specific or dance specific activity. The transition period, their volume is going to start to lower while the intensity is increasing. And then that continues on into the competition stage where the volume's quite low, but it's very intense and very specific to the sport or the dance activity. So you can see here that you want to be, the whole point of this is that you're peaking at the most important time. You want to be in your best shape and your best abilities at your performance time or at your competition time, at your audition time. That's what I'm looking for. So, and then from here, there should be an active, after that period, there should be that active rest where things kind of lower back down. So there are different types of periodization. There's linear periodization, which is what this graph is showing, which is a more gradual progression from high volume, low load to lower volume, high load. And this is usually better at improving strength. And then there's another model called undulating periodization, which involves larger changes in intensity and volume within the microcycle. I'm not going to get into that one as much because it's going to be a little bit more complicated. But as a note, this one is usually better at improving anytime game readiness or performance, but there's a higher risk of overtraining due to the relative high intensities. I'm thinking for dancers right now, the linear periodization is going to be a better time just because we, like I said, we tend not to have an off period and overuse injuries to be so prevalent. I just don't want to promote more overtraining. So I think following more of that linear progression may be an easier and safer approach at this time. And then these are my references. And thank you so much for joining. Have a good day.